the same types of controls that you might see in China or in Russia. The plan is to institute those here, which is ironic because one of the big points of the right wing, over the last few years was freedom of speech. And they felt that, progressive culture was restricting freedom of expression, and that was something they really needed to correct.
Yeah, well, that's a lie. I mean, that's a complete lie, isn't it? I mean, embodied in the hypocrisy of Peter Thiel, who sells himself as a kind of techno-libertarian, but is chairman of Palantir, which is the engine of surveillance of much of the US government and indeed Israel and lots of others. I mean, Palantir is at the vanguard of software that aggregates all data across government about us as individuals. It's an extraordinary and unprecedented power and knowledge that the government, the state, and indeed companies, it's much worse than surveillance capitalism.
So for people who don't know, Carne is a former British diplomat who then became an anarchist. Or maybe you were always an anarchist, but we're hiding out. You still advise different countries, I believe, on diplomacy and so on. And I saw your most recent piece is on the collapse of a rules-based order, which does seem to be what's happening right now. So yeah, I mean, I've really enjoyed our talks in the past. I felt it would be great just to beam in with you and see where you are in the current, state of things. It's certainly a very eerie and ominous time in the United States. Certainly we seem to be descending into a kind of lawless fascism, if one was to name it. And it's happened quite efficiently and with shocking little resistance, I would say. I would be curious, I guess, how you perceive that. Is it surprising for you that this has happened, or, is this kind of like just a continuation of business as usual, just in a more direct way?
No, I mean, I'm watching it very closely with great concern. I mean, my wife and children are America. As you know, I lived for 17 years in New York City. And it's good to be back with you, Daniel. Thank you for inviting me to this chat. No, I mean, we watch with enormous alarm and distress what's going on. I don't think it's to be expected. In a sense, one could have expected it. And indeed, 12 years ago, when I wrote my last book, I said we should beware a grinning new dictator in sharp suits and with a good television manner. And indeed, that's kind of what we've got.
I don't find his suits very sharp.
well, I think, I mean, it was a very vague prediction, so easy to get right. But the issue is that things were bad beforehand, chaotic, even disordered. Society was coming apart largely because of inequality, largely because the large bulk of the American people, like across the West, have seen their living standards decline. And people don't feel represented by supposedly democratic government. And there would be a consequence to that. And Trump is that consequence. He is, the many, many other things that have led to him, not least the separation of the Democratic Party from any connection to quote unquote ordinary voters. The fact that it has become a completely cut off elite party with its own corrupt interests, etc. That's obviously another factor. But I do see what is happening with Trump as part of a kind of reaction to what is already happening in the world, which is instability and growing instability. And that instability, I think, will get worse, I'm afraid. Capitalism, unless profoundly reformed, systemically reformed, will continue to cause chaos, both socially within society and with the planet. And reaction to that, there will be individuals who pop up and say, I will control the chaos. I will speak for you. You who feel you have no control, I will offer you that control. an illusory offer. Of course, it's a lie, it's a fraud, but they will offer it because they're egoistic and want power, like most politicians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's obviously a lot to unpack and think about there. I mean, one theory that I've heard that's been interesting to me is that yeah, I mean, obviously this is connected to phenomena we're seeing all around the world with the rise of right-wing populism, as you mentioned. And America always thought it was kind of a special case somehow, because I guess we had so much power and so much wealth. And yeah, there was a kind of the Democrats were unable to address the needs of the working class in a way that led to deepening frustration. And in a situation where you only have choice A or choice B, ultimately everybody's going to choose choice B, whatever choice B is. So all these people have chosen choice B, and what choice B has turned out to be is, they kind of told us most of it, I guess, beforehand. We were sort of warned. But to some extent, it feels like, to me anyway, that there's kind of like a global oligarchic mafia that is behind the scenes. I don't know if exactly pulling the strings in a kind of conspiratorial way, but I guess one interpretation of what's happening I've heard, which I thought was sort of interesting, was that there was sort of like this sort of global, wealth oligarchy kind of determined, some years ago that it was kind of time for the United States to fall in the same way that Russia had, the USSR had fallen, because essentially capitalism, has all this money pooled at the top, and there isn't really, particularly with ecological decline and energy decline, there isn't really new markets anymore. So if you have, what Naomi Klein talked about is like the shock doctrine or disaster capitalism, if you have like a massive breakdown, it actually liberates a lot of potential for capitalism. Because, for instance, I suspect that one of the plans here is ultimately to make it impossible for the U.S. to actually pay back its debt. So then you have some kind of, default or whatever that means, or just, so then the U.S. is forced to sell off public assets, public lands to the highest bidder. And yeah, it liberates a lot of assets for capital. So that's one of the things that seems like it might be going on here. And it's almost like the way that the U.S. is systemically destroying its own brain trust is also hard to explain from even the perspective of far-right, Christian evangelical. Why would you want there to be no diabetes research? Why would you want there to be no cancer research? Why would you want to I guess there's some reason we wouldn't want to know what the weather anymore, but we're forcing, all of these scientists and researchers to flee to other countries. It feels like a deliberate act of destruction against the U.S. from within the U.S. to some extent. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, anti-intellectualism and anti-science sentiments are, of course, a fairly common trope of dictators, of authoritarians, because they claim to speak for the ordinary man who is skeptical of experts who they think talk down to them. I don't necessarily feel there's a kind of sinister plot behind it. I always feel in my political analysis that usually, or in fact almost invariably, what is going on is on the surface. There isn't anything else to see. And Trump has declared what he is, and the oligarchs have pledged their support to him. So, I think it's pretty clear what is going on. I mean, it's very parallel, albeit in a less extreme form, to Weimar Germany. A sense of decline in America, a sense that democracy is not working for the ordinary man, and a dictator steps forward who is able to articulate that almost kind of Gnostic sense of distress. It's far beyond policy prescriptions. It's a kind of elemental thing that Trump is able to channel is able to express almost by chance. I don't think he does it deliberately, but when he gets angry and channels the anger, he's somehow reflecting what clearly a lot of people in America feel. Go back to the anti-intellectualism. During the Brexit campaign here in Britain, a senior Tory who was no anti-intellectual himself, he declared it in some press interview or something, we've had enough of experts. He was told, the experts believed quite correctly that Britain leaving the EU would be a disaster. And he said, we've had enough of experts. Everybody has had enough of experts. And I thought that was a very striking statement of a rejection of kind of upper middle class elitism, urban elites who people outside of those groups feel are looking down on them. And that's certainly a phenomenon here. It's a phenomenon in the US too. Trump's vote is concentrated outside the coastal urban areas, just as the right-wing Brexit and reform vote, which is our own kind of little Trump, is concentrated outside of the big cities in decaying northern towns, coastal towns that are in pretty bad shape, and where people feel quite reasonably very ignored by the urban elites who concentrate on identity politics and yada, 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 rather than the needs of the common man. And I say man deliberately because there is a definite gendered aspect to this.
Yeah, I mean, I do tend to think there's a little bit of a hidden orchestration around. So, for instance, like the day after Trump announced his first round of tariffs on Liberation Day, it was like a golf tournament sponsored by the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund. It just feels like these types of policies that Trump is doing. Everyone's like, oh, he's so chaotic. He doesn't know what he's doing. It seems like it actually does support. I mean, for instance, the tariffs are kind of a strike against the middle class, the upper middle class in the U.S. primarily, and the sort of even the lower millionaire class. So if you have a little bit of a small factory overseas, or you import, vintage furniture from Europe or something, you're stuck. Like you can't do anything because you don't know when these things are going to change. You can't plan for the future. So it seems like, I mean, they learned a lot from other dictators who tried to centralize and concentrate power in a very high speed way, and the tariffs are actually part of that.
The tariffs are not really happening yet. I mean, I know they're still threatened, but Trump keeps putting them off as has become well known. And of course, tariffs hurt everybody. They don't just hurt a particular segment of society. I mean, they hurt farmers, they hurt steel workers, they hurt car manufacturers. They push up inflation for everybody in society. I mean, they are incredibly stupid, and decades of trade policy has been devoted to trying to get rid of them around the world. And again, there's a parallel with Brexit and Trump, is that Trump and Brexit Britain are the only two places that have actually sought to increase trade barriers rather than decrease them. So there's an interesting parallel there. It's a kind of isolationism. It's a kind of erroneous belief that the rest of the world can pay for their own problems rather than the US or anyone else having to pay for it themselves. I mean, it's a deeply nationalistic, American-centric view of the world. I don't necessarily see evidence for it being planned, though. I mean, the tariff imposition, the announcement, was so incredibly cack-handed, so fantastically stupid, that the tariffs were calculated on the basis of the trade deficit with each country, not on any other calculation of the actual barriers to trade with that particular country, but just as a result of the trade deficit. So you've got these extraordinary aberrations of Vietnam and islands populated only by penguins getting high tariffs. I mean, it doesn't speak of a carefully prepared kind of coup or secret machination. It instead speaks of an incredibly idiotic, incompetent regime.
Perhaps. I mean, I like this comment that Jerry Weinstein made in the chat here. The chaos around the tariffs is their point. But and yes, the impact is across sectors. But obviously, if you're the owner of Walmart or one of Trump's billionaire corporate cronies, you have the cushion of wealth to not really be impacted. Whereas if you're a small farmer, who now can't even harvest your food because of illegal immigrants, and then you have tariffs, I mean, you're basically going to go out of business. And that's going to allow a larger agribusiness corporation to buy up that farm. So the theory would be, it is chaotic, it is turbulent. They are in some ways stupid, but the underlying logic is centralization, control, and forcing kind of the mid-range of businesses and industries just out, so that there's a further consolidation of wealth and power at the top, which benefits them.
Yeah, I think that's right, Daniel. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, in a way, it's an acceleration of what was already happening in capitalism generally, because we've seen, the disparity between the grotesquely wealthy and everybody else grow in every single capitalist country. It's happening everywhere. And Trump is just accelerating it and selling it on the basis that it's not capitalism that is to blame for people being disempowered and disenfranchised democratically and economically humiliated. It is illegal immigrants who are to blame for that. And that's a very common authoritarian playbook. The question is whether the American electorate will buy it if they have a chance to vote again, because I suspect, I'm afraid, that there is a good chance they won't have a chance to vote again, that Trump will declare a state of emergency or something, some combination of drugs and terrorists and illegal immigrants and Mexican drug cartels or whatever, and will declare another state of emergency and suspend elections on those grounds. I think that's a really plausible scenario, I'm afraid. And that maybe he already knows that he's not going to be able to convince the majority that, his centralizing agenda, as you put it, is actually in their interests. The people will see that the king has no clothes. However, there isn't any sign that they're seeing that the king has no clothes yet, is there really, in America? I mean, polls still standing up for Trump. There's no sign of erosion of his core base support.
Yeah, I've been trying to understand that. I mean, obviously his popularity has sunk. I think it's like, below 40% or something, but that's still a lot. And his core constituency is still holding fast. I mean, yeah, and some of that is, as somebody else asked in the chat, about Christian evangelicals, and kind of they're just all in for this. They believe that Trump is sort of the agent of a divine reckoning, or of the revelation, or the apocalypse, or like and yeah, I mean, obviously, I mean, I think in some ways, among the fact that it's very sad to be, to see this happening anywhere, and to think of all the misery and unnecessary cruelty and suffering that's being inflicted on people for no good reason. One of my fears is that really what's happening is, they're trying to build a model to export around the world. Just as the American Revolution became the template for kind of like, modern nation state, liberal nation state, democracies at various limits. This is like a second American Revolution. And, there are these different factions and forces that have come together. So in terms of the tech oligarch side, like Mark Andreessen and Peter Thiel, one of their big influences is a book called The Sovereign Individual, which was written by two, I think, English libertarian economists, which basically argued, I think it was back in like 2002 or something, that because of the, information technology revolution, the nation state was ultimately obsolete. And ultimately where we would go would be what they talked about as commercialized sovereignty. And another person who's part of that group who's been articulating this is this guy Balaji Srinivasan, who wrote a book called The Network State. And so essentially the idea is that there's no more any public sphere or public goods. There will be like private jurisdictions, kind of like corporatized, controlled areas. So people will be kind of in this sort of serfdom relationship to these, sort of corporate state commercialized sovereign districts. They can be virtual or territorial or both. And that's how people will be given, the basics of their living. So that would make sense, with this sort of effort to kind of like wipe out a lot of, what was the federal government or the realm of public goods or the commons and so on. But I think that this is a model combined with sort of the mind control of social media and Fox News and so on that they fully intend to export everywhere if they can, as they fine tune it here. So that makes me concerned about really just this sort of sunset of emancipation, freedom, human freedom and democracy, in its limited and imperfect form as we've had it, as something that could be really on its way out everywhere. I don't know how you feel about that.
Well, as you were describing that vision, I thought, well, you could be describing America or indeed much of the West and capitalist society already. I mean, the commons have been eroded, have been completely undermined, have been appropriated by the very rich. The bulk of society is sustained on low-wage labor or welfare at the lowest possible level for survival. Healthcare, well, you know that better than me, but in this country, healthcare is rationed by waiting. People die just as they do in America because they don't get adequate healthcare. And, it is all propped up by a kind of system of ideological control. I've forgotten the name of the author, thingy called capitalist realism. This sense that we're in this. Mark Fisher, thank you. The sense that we're in, the situation and it is immutable. It is a kind of Darwinist inevitability that we cannot change. And that is an ideological piece of propaganda because it's not actually true, because of course we can change anything if we choose. So what you're describing is to me just a kind of more extreme reiteration of what we already have. I mean, the state does not exist to protect the whole. If that's what it claims to do, but it actually protects the interests of the few over the interests of the whole. It protects capital over labor.
Yeah. Well, that's why my first question for you was around, like, do you see this as something new or more like a logical extension? I mean, I guess in some ways it's both, but I do want to say that there are things that are new about it, like the kind of potential kind of like assimilation of all forms of data on the citizen, and how that can be used in all sorts of sophisticated ways to manipulate or silence people and so on. And also, I've never really experienced in my life a fear of speaking out. I mean, I now have a lot of European friends who hope to travel to the US or live here as naturalized citizens, and they're like scrubbing their social media of anything related to Palestine or Gaza or anti-Trump. So this whatever the internal contradictions of America and however much it actually was a sort of capitalist monstrosity more than a democratic republic or whatever. I mean, now we're seeing it does feel like a shift from a sort of soft paradigm to a very harsh paradigm, where the same types of controls that you might see in China or in Russia, the plan is to institute those here, which is ironic because one of the big, kind of like points of the right wing, over the last few years was freedom of speech, and they felt that, the liberal, culture, progressive culture was restricting freedom of expression, and that was something they really needed to correct.
Yeah,
but
well,
now
that's a lie. I mean, that's a complete lie, isn't it? I mean, embodied in the hypocrisy of Peter Thiel, who sells himself as a kind of techno-libertarian, but is chairman of Palantir, which is the engine of surveillance of much of the U.S. government and indeed Israel and lots of others. I mean, Palantir is at the vanguard of software that aggregates all data across government about us as individuals. It's an extraordinary and unprecedented power and knowledge that the government, the state, and indeed companies, it's much worse than surveillance capitalism, as Shoshana Zuboff wrote about. It is now the state is aggregating the data. I'm sure you saw the piece in the New Yorker recently about the Australian who was stopped at the border because he'd written a Substack about the protests at Columbia University. Now, of course, the DHS is not reading Substacks. This is data that was collected by some AI that is going around the internet, collecting data and aggregating data on all of us and red flagging particular people. I have no doubt, for instance, that my name is under some red flag. My relationships with Kurdish militants, Sahrawi rebels, God help us, the list is long. I speak out about Gaza. I speak out about Trump. I'm not risking coming back to the US anytime soon, which is tragic because I love America and I loved New York City. It was, I see it as my second home. And, as I say, my family is from there. But it is an extraordinary new power. And I think we're only just beginning to see the beginning of what it really means. I'm sorry to say. I mean, we should look at very square in the face at China, what's going on in China, the sort of complete surveillance that they have in China, where citizens are marked on a kind of index of how well behaved they are. And on the basis of their score on that index, they can get holidays, discounts. And if you score low on that index, you're not allowed to travel, you're not allowed to move city, etc., etc. And I think we're heading towards that because the pattern has been that where China has innovated particular forms of surveillance, the West has soon followed. And that's because it's not just techno-authoritarians like Thiel who want this. The state wants this. The state is inherently a tool of control. The state exists to provide this contract of security for the people, and that security is getting harder and harder for them to provide. And thus, the state will always reach out for tools of control whenever they are available. And they are, unfortunately, now more available than they have ever been. It's a very, very worrying time. And not just because of Trump, but also because of the relation, this deeper level of the relationship between the state and the population, which I think is going to become much more hostile.
Are you seeing any encouraging signs or plausible resistance strategies or kind of like alternatives emerging?
Well, when I first started talking about anarchism, 15 years ago, nobody listened. They laughed you out of the room. And they would literally giggle when you'd say anarchism. And now you get an audience. And I know a lot of people who identify themselves as anarchists. I personally believe either we go towards anarchism or we will drop into the abyss of authoritarianism that Trump is and others are opening for us. We have to fundamentally change the way we operate democratically, economically. And you talk to young people, they need no convincing that we're in a chaotic, deeply troubled situation. They don't believe the status quo is going to hold. Something is coming, and whether that is good or bad is kind of up to them to a degree. And I think that realization has gripped a lot of people in the younger generation, which in a sense is encouraging. In a sense, it's kind of awful for them. I feel for them. The other thing is technology also works for us. Social media I see as still, you had Mika Sifri on chatting with him the other day. Of course, he was the great promoter of technology as, the Personal Democracy Forum that he and Andrew Rushier used to hold in New York City. the technology and the internet would be tools of democracy, of democratization, and instead they've become something else. But social media is still incredibly powerful. I think of Gaza, and the anger and criticism of Israel over Gaza is largely a function of social media. The fact that even though Israel has kept out international journalists, there are still huge amounts of video of what is going on in Gaza. And that kind of democratization of the means of communication and the means of advertising what's going on, I think is still very powerful. It's a really... the other example I thought of actually on that score was that video that I'm sure everybody has seen of people, where was it, in California, yelling at ICE officials trying to arrest people and sort of saying, get the fuck out and go home and all this kind of stuff. You would not have seen that necessarily 20 years ago, let alone 75 years ago. And that is a powerful tool of resistance.
And what are you working with particular countries right now in an advisory capacity?
Yes, I work with northeast Syria. I mean, it's not a whole country; it's an autonomous region.
Is that Rojava?
That is Rojava. It's majority Kurdish, but it's not only Kurdish; it's also Arab and Yazidi and Assyrian Christian, and is a separate, autonomously run area of Syria, which nobody talks about. It's a bottom-up democracy. It's a feminist democracy where women have leadership positions in every institution. It's also an ecological society. I mean, all of this sounds great. Of course, the reality is a bit more compromised than that, and it's a work in progress. But as a project of democracy, it's an extraordinary and isolated example of the kind of society I would like to see. And I do what I can to support them, primarily diplomatically, because that's my experience. And that's what I can offer some practical help with. So I'm closely in touch with them. I speak to them pretty much every day.
That's awesome. I mean, when I wrote my 2016 book, How Soon Is Now, where I was trying to figure out how we would redesign post-industrial civilization to avert ecological cataclysm, I stumbled on the work of Murray Bookchin, who's a social ecologist, wrote this book, Ecology of Freedom, where he's basically an anarchist. He said that private property in itself could not be, would not allow for the emergence of a ecologically sustainable world. Like we would need something beyond private property. But I know that Ocalan, who was the sort of philosopher who inspired Rojava, somehow hooked into Murray Bookchin's ideas when he was in prison, and based his political philosophy. I think he's still in prison actually.
Yes, he is. Yeah.
Yep.
He's Abdullah Öcalan is the leader of the Kurdish resistance movement in Turkey called the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, and he's in fact in negotiation with the Turkish government at the moment because he's declared the end of the armed struggle of the PKK against the Turkish state and has said that armed struggle is no longer the way to go. And as you say, he was exposed to Bookchin's ideas whilst he was in solitary confinement on this little island where he remains, and read Bookchin's work and sort of transposed them to the Middle East context and came up with a concept called democratic confederalism, which is basically of bottom-up governed society, where the commune is the kind of basic political unit, and where necessary for decisions at a larger scale, those communes confederate to make bigger decisions. There's also strong feminist and ecological aspects to it. Ecological from Bookchin's thought, feminist more from the fact that the PKK is very much a kind of women have a very powerful role in the PKK as fighters, as leaders, as theorists of revolution. And the idea of the feminist democracy that we see in Rojava is a result of PKK cadres, thinking about what kind of society they wish to see, where it's not just women's rights. Women are absolutely central to defending the the state, it's not a state, sorry, the entity itself, unless you have women who defend themselves, then you don't have a viable society. And it's self-defense not only of the territory, but also of the woman in the home. So it's a comprehensive revolution, a social revolution of interpersonal relations, as well as a political revolution of how we should govern ourselves. It's the most extraordinary thing.
Have you gone down there and visited it personally?
Yeah, I went 10 years ago and made a film that you can see online that's partly about Rojava. About 15 minutes of it is about Rojava. It's called Accidental Anarchist, and it's kind of my story. But the bit about Rojava is also excerpted, sound the right word, on I think my Facebook page, and a couple of other places. So you can see it. That was 10 years ago. But what has changed since 10 years ago? Of course, the Assad regime fell at the end of last year, and we have a new government in Damascus, which unfortunately, although it's a lot better than Assad, who murdered 150,000 of his people, is threatening to become a kind of theocratic, semi-authoritarian state. I'm afraid to say, even though the leader, Ahmad al-Sharaa, is putting a very good face in it. And the people in the northeast of Syria are very skeptical of what's going on in Damascus. But that's yet to really play out. What kind of Syria we will see has yet to be determined.
And is that, do they basically arm everybody at this point? I guess it's almost, we have a Democratic Socialist candidate for mayor in New York. That's created a lot of excitement. He very likely will win, I would assume. I almost wonder if, it's, I hate to be thinking in this way, but if we need to be able to actually have, the liberals and the Democrats have to start arming up, because I'm beginning to feel a premonition of concern with what's happening with ICE, where they were just given a budget of $150 billion to build essentially concentration camps all over the US, that we could be gearing up for something here that is, familiar from the 20th century and beyond. But it could be that, following the logic to the extreme, I could see us ending up with a kind of internal genocide here, not just of illegal immigrants and minorities, but even of sort of liberals and sort of urban intellectuals. And it seems like they're really setting the table for that right now. There's this guy Jack Posobiec. He and this guy Josh Lisek are white Christian nationalists with large followings on Twitter. Posobiec traveled with Vance to Munich, and they wrote a book called Unhumans. And the theme in the book is that leftists, communists, liberals, even, progressives are not fully human. They don't need to be treated as humans. And that actually Pinochet and Franco and Pinochet's helicopter killings is what we need in the US. And this book came out before the election, and I think there was one New York Times op-ed about it, but it really didn't get that much coverage. But both J.D. Vance and Donald Trump blurbed the book and said that this is the right plan for the U.S. And you now see Trump keeps upping and once again, you might say, it's chaotic, but it feels like either he's just reading the room intuitively, or, one analysis of him I read recently said that he's an interesting figure, Trump, and that he's just an episodic person. He doesn't really have a core or sense of self or a core set of beliefs. He just, takes every moment as whatever it is. But anyway, on Saturday, he gave a speech after the budget bill where he said, "I hate the Democrats. I hate all the Democrats." And I could just see a situation where kind of like the Hutus and the Tutsis, where you have this, armed, infuriated rural population that's been fed mind poison for decades and has read like the Turner Diaries, which is like a fictional fantasy of a
Yeah.
massacre, and so on. It's like it just feels like it's sort of like heading in that direction. And
You could well be right, Daniel.
yeah,
The history of Germany, of Hitler's Germany, tells us a number of things. Trump is not Hitler. Let's make that clear. But one of the things about Hitler was that the population who resisted him, the resistance, if you like, consistently underestimated him all along, right up until the Second World War. They thought this guy is chaotic, he's a buffoon, he's not going to do what he says he's going to do. The other thing is that he was absolutely clear about what he was going to do from a very early stage. Mein Kampf was very clear about his hatred of the Jews and his desire to get rid of them. Dachau, the concentration camp, was built in 1932, I think it was opened, when Hitler first came to power. And the persecution of the Jews only ramped up all the way through the 30s. And yet there were still people who believed that, it wasn't going to be that bad. The persecution ebbed and flowed. Of course, Hitler said, we're not going to annihilate the Jews. We're not going to wage war on our neighbors. And people chose to believe him. And as a result, any resistance against him was completely crushed. People were arrested en masse, tortured, executed or murdered, who stood up against him, and he was able to establish absolute power, as we know. But I'm struck by the fact that there wasn't really a secret agenda. Although the final solution eventually, the extermination of the Jewish population of Germany and the rest of Europe was in a sense planned in secret, the idea of eradicating Jews from the German population was completely open in Nazi ideology, in Hitler's ideology. He was really clear about that. The idea of Germany having to have living space, Lebensraum, was again something he was completely open about, and people just chose not to believe him. And I think the minimum we should be doing is taking Trump and Vance and their philosophers who stand behind them. We should take them very seriously. We should take them at their word. What they say is what they mean, and we should prepare for the possibility that their words will actually eventually turn into actions. And I think that means we should, very seriously think about what resistance looks like. It's not just, it's far, far from having a good progressive candidate for New York City mayor. It's far, far from electoral. It's actually about physical survival. And ultimately, one doesn't want to be alarmist, but I think it's worth thinking in those terms.
It's very hard to imagine, as an urban liberal intellectual, who's also, I'm like 59, I'm not like 25 at this point. I don't really imagine, my type of people, even the younger versions of them, forming militias and buying, machine guns and, building preparatory tunnels and all that stuff, in like New York City, Chicago, San Francisco, and so on.
But they left. A lot of people left. A lot of people, the ones who survived in Germany are the ones who got out.
Yeah.
No, they couldn't. No militia could beat the SS or the stormtroopers. That was impossible, or the Gestapo. It was an overweening, powerful state. And as we just discussed, the power of surveillance in the hands of the state now mean that I think resistance is going to be extremely difficult. But the people who survived got out. The people who underestimated it, who played it down, who said this guy. Hitler was a kind of idiot in every respect, except his ability to galvanize the masses, to voice what the masses wanted. His economic policies were chaotic. He got up in the middle of the day. He didn't look at policy papers. He let his advisors argue it out. Who does this remind you of?
Yeah. So your advocacy for people in the U.S. should be to escape the U.S. right now?
I think I'm not saying this to my American friends and my American family. At least have a lifeboat ready, for the moment when things get worse. I hope we're really wrong. I hope they won't get worse, but they may well. And I think if that happens, have thought through where you would go. Get your passport ready. Dig out your Irish great-grandparents or your Polish great-grandparents. Get an EU passport if you can. I'm sorry to put it in such dramatic terms, but I know quite a lot of people who are doing precisely this.
Right. And then what happens in the US? I mean, this becomes a full-fledged totalitarian state. I mean, Germany ultimately was defeated because there wasn't America. If there's no America, then what's the end point for this system?
One simply doesn't know. I mean, but the seeds of Nazi Germany's destruction were sown by Nazi Germany. I mean, it was an unsustainable venture. This idea of invading the rest of Europe to create room for Germans was crazy. I mean, it wasn't just obscene and horrible. It was actually crazy because it was completely unsustainable. And the Nazis had to keep going forward, otherwise they would collapse. And there's a sense of that with Trump. The stability and kind of doing the same thing every day isn't enough. There always has to be something new. There has to be something more. There has to be momentum towards some goal, which he never really articulates what that end point is, apart from, America being great again. And it's always about the journey. And what that says to me is, there's inherent in it a risk that the bicycle will topple over when they have to stop. And they will have to stop at some point.
Are there any things that I've been looking at some books about kind of resistance movements? There's a nice book about the Serbian kind of movement that sort of toppled the what's that?
Yes, Otpor.
Yeah,
run by my friend Sergej Popovic.
Exactly, I think it's his book that I'm reading.
Sergej's book, yeah.
Is there stuff from that could maybe help our situation at this point, or is it too far gone for that? Or
no,
I
totally.
do remember when Bush was president, there was a time where it felt like there was going to be endless war and sort of pseudo dictatorship and so on. And then I really remember that I think it was like Stephen Colbert speaking at the press correspondents' dinner. It was like suddenly like it punctured the whole balloon, like the satire suddenly, nobody could quite take the whole venture seriously after that. And it really had a cascading effect. So, and I do wonder if there's something, it's all, you can't expect that or anticipate that, but the sort of, the ideological fervor, can somehow get dismantled in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, in Nazi Germany, the large majority of Germans supported Hitler. The large majority. He would have plebiscites where, obviously there was intimidation and cheating and whatnot, but he'd get 98% of the vote. That wouldn't happen in America. There's a very clear, probably majority of people who don't want Trump, who resist him. So it's a very different balance of power. Yes, there are things to be learned from, the resistance to dictatorship, whether against Mubarak or Assad or Serbia's authoritarians, the successors of Milosevic. Sergej's book is well worth reading, but also, Sergej learned at the foot of, the genius of nonviolence resistance, who's Gene Sharp, who literally wrote the book of nonviolent resistance, and gave us a handbook of techniques. There's no way you can claim you don't know what nonviolence resistance looks like, because Gene has written it out. It's all there, and there are various iterations of that. You can download it on the web. And
I read that book and wrote about it recently. Yeah, he has like 198 different tactics. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And there's various other books like that in the genre, and one of the things that we have to appreciate about the world, of course, is its complexity. Things connect in ways we cannot see. We're dealing with a whole system whose machinations are basically unintelligible to us. We cannot tell what action A will lead to action B. That pathway is not linear. It is a non-Newtonian world. We can't tell what will work in fighting incipient dictatorship. And what that says to me is that we have to try lots of things and see what works. And it may be, a child in Missouri who invents the thing or leads the movement, establishes the meme that becomes the thing that destabilizes the regime. I don't know. In a sense, that's a cause for optimism. I don't think there is necessarily one model of resistance. I don't think there should be one leader of the resistance, Mamdani or anybody else, because if there is a single leader, that person will become the focus of the regime's attempts to suppress them. They will be, probably murdered.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King was murdered. RFK was murdered. I hope Mamdani has good bodyguards already. But I don't think it should be a leaderless movement, but there should be lots of leaders. They should be, in a sense, redundancy built into the system, and we should try lots of different things.
Yeah. I'll let you go in a few minutes, Carne. It's great to chat again. Maybe I'll visit you in England, as I
Please.
I have an Irish.
London's great, so come here. Find your asylum here.
I'm going to look into my Irish grandmother situation.
Yeah.
That's yeah. But I was curious also. I saw you were writing a bit about Israel and Palestine and Gaza and so on. And I guess I'm just curious what your perspective is as to kind of why the sort of Western world it continues to kind of line up behind Netanyahu to such an extreme degree, even when there's so much popular protest, and it's obviously, the people in Germany or wherever, hate that this is happening. I think the U.S. is kind of a special case, maybe, because, on the one hand, there's a lot of, integration with Israel on a military level, but I think also for, the white Christian nationalists backing Trump, they love Israel, not just because of the prophecies and revelation and all that stuff that they think is going to happen, but also because Israel is this model of a ethno-religious state that ruthlessly purges and suppresses and does whatever it wants to its minority population. And that's what they want to do here. But yeah, I'm curious, do you think there's like blackmail underlying it, fear of Israeli assassinations? What do you think is the reason there's such a lockstep behind Israel even at this point?
Well, let's start by noting that lockstep seems to be breaking up. Political support for Israel seems to be in decline in quite a precipitous way in the U.S. across party spectrum. I was very struck by Steve Bannon's criticisms of the U.S. for supporting Israel in its attacks on Iran. But the reason for Western support and America, one reason is of course complete naivety about what kind of people we've got in charge in Israel. I think the West's governments are about 20 years behind political developments in Israel and the kind of people who are actually running the government and calling the shots. These are extremists. These are, racists, ethno-nationalists, people who openly call for the expulsion and, if necessary, the annihilation of the Palestinian population. And they hold the whip hand in Netanyahu's cabinet. They are why Netanyahu's continuing this grotesque campaign in Gaza. And I think many people in the West, instead want to believe this kind of very, very outdated model of Israel as this kind of rights-respecting, law-abiding democracy. It's not a democracy. I mean, the Arab population, it's an apartheid state. They're treated as second-class citizens in all kinds of different ways. I thought the most striking recent example was the lack of bomb shelters in Arab villages and areas of big cities when Iranian missiles were falling on Israel. There were plenty of bomb shelters for Jewish Israelis, but none for the Arabs. And if that isn't a kind of demonstration of an apartheid, deeply unjust society, I don't know what is. And I think, people in the West can be very, very naive about that. I still hear on national radio Israel described as, the only democracy in the Middle East. And it's not a democracy. It is illegally occupying somebody else's land very violently, and has been doing so for many decades, and has resisted all attempts to end that occupation. That for some reason people are willing to be blind to that. The Christian nationalists in America are arguably more honest about it, because they see a reflection of their own ideals in the Zionist dream, which is basically a colonial dream that dates back. You look at where its intellectual forefathers were; they were, echoing European colonialism at the time, and a notion of racial superiority, and that clearly drove them to a degree. And Israel today, reflects that. And obviously, there are parts of America that are quite happy about that it reflects, America's own history of appropriation of indigenous people's land in the name of some greater vision of a new state. In America, you all know what the vision of the new state was supposed to be: the American dream, liberty, freedom from persecution. The Zionist dream is not a million miles from there. To a degree, America sees itself, or certain Americans see themselves in Israel. But I think it's coming to an end when we see what has been done in Gaza, when finally journalists are let in, and we get the proper death tolls, which are going to be far above the 60,000 now reported. I think things will change for perceptions of Israel.
I've heard that it's, I've been looking all over for reports on what the actual death count is. Ralph Nader had an article in Commons Read as 375,000, something like that. Have you heard any more specific figures around that?
No, and I don't know how you would come up with a figure in these circumstances. It's absolutely chaotic. And you can see what's happened to Gaza. It's been reduced to rubble, and many tens of thousands of bodies are under that rubble.
Yeah. A nice comment from a woman on our comments here, Marjorie Shalita. She said, those who have the means and foresight to make plans to leave the U.S. need to think again. The natural urge to leave speaks to our lowest instinct to survive, which, while it must be respected, must also be overridden by our higher longing to evolve. Listen to that voice inside that comes from wisdom, integrity, and courage. What do you think of that perspective?
Total respect for that perspective. Total respect. This is an individual decision of gravity. I would never say to anybody, they must leave. It's their choice. And if they want to stay and resist, I'm not actually saying leave right now. I'm saying prepare your lifeboat, for the eventuality that it may get worse. I think that's only sensible.
Totally. I'm enough of a history scholar. I'm a big fan of Walter Benjamin, and he just left like a few days too late, and so you never know also when the sort of, Trump could declare a national emergency tomorrow and close all the airports and so on.
Absolutely. It could happen very rapidly. All he needs to do is sign an executive order declaring a national emergency. He's already declared an emergency on the southern border. He's already naming Antifa, people who damaged Tesla dealerships, as terrorists. It would take very little for this to be actually concretized into a national emergency where civil liberties are abolished. And I wonder how much resistance there would be to that. the rhetoric of the threats to America, from everything from Venezuelan street gangs to narco cartels to illegal immigrants or, whatever, is so pervasive, particularly on right-wing media, that I wonder to what extent the population would actually complain if civil liberties were removed. I mean, again, that's another lesson from Nazi Germany, is that, when the economy was getting better, and I think that is a prerequisite for Trump's survival, but as long as the economy was getting better and people felt things were better, they didn't care about democracy or civil liberties.
Yep. All right, then. I think, what else is there to say at this particular moment? What are you enjoying these days?
What am I enjoying? I'm enjoying doing video casts. That's a new thing for me. I'm enjoying working with Syria, which is extraordinarily interesting. And
I mean, I would love to go there. It seems very difficult. Yeah.
Oh, no, we should be in touch, Daniel. I can help you get there. It's doable. It's a bit of a step. You have to go in through northern Iraq. It's a bit of a pain in the arse. But it's actually much better to go now than it was 6 months ago, because the Turks were bombing Rojava regularly 6 months ago, and that stopped, I'm glad to say.
Yeah.
So I'm enjoying all that. I'm enjoying London, I have to say. This is the first time I've lived here for an extended period for a very, very long time. I spent most of my life abroad, and London has changed extraordinarily from the city of my childhood. It's now something like 50% foreign born. It's incredibly cosmopolitan. On the bus you hear Urdu, Ukrainian, Chinese. There's a huge influx of Hong Kongers, of Ukrainians, but, every different nationality. In many ways, it strikes me as more diverse than New York City, which is saying something. So it's going through a good moment, even if politically
I might challenge you there, because I feel New York is also, incredibly diverse and amazing right now. It's like, I mean, these two cities are great examples of, kind of multicultural, cooperation in a way. Like, it's.
I agree. But the big difference, I have to say, Daniel, is that New York is economically segregated in a way that London is not. There is no kind of, lower Manhattan or Upper East Side. I mean, there are areas of London that are rich, but they're cheek by jowl with much poorer areas. Public housing is not all to be found above 116th Street. It's all over the city, including in the richest areas of the city. So you don't get that sense that there are areas of the city where, ordinary people just do not tread. Perhaps there's a bit of Knightsbridge, which has been bought up by Russian oligarchs and sheikhs and, all kinds of dodgy people. Bits of Knightsbridge are like that. But apart from that, everywhere in the city is much more economically mixed, which is great.
Cool. All right. Well, let's just stay in touch. We'll do this another time. Or maybe we'll find a third interlocutor, which you can do with this Substack program. Do you know my friend Melik Kylan?
No.
He's a writer for Wall Street Journal and Forbes. I mean, he's considerably more conservative than I am in many issues, including immigration and so on. But he's also extremely wise and intelligent, and I really enjoy. He's like somebody I can have different things of opinions with in a civil and sort of shared curiosity kind of a manner.
It sounds great. Yeah. And, it's been wonderful to talk to you, Daniel. Thank you for talking with me. And greetings to Jerry Weinstein, who I see is on the call.
Yeah, he's I know from a lot of great comments.
I know from Occupy Days. So greetings, Jerry. Good to see you.
And please, everybody, follow Carne's Substack. Follow mine if you don't already. And we will do this again soon. It's great to see you, Carne.
Yeah, you too, Daniel. Thanks so much for having me.